Friends, good morning, and welcome here to Dayspring to Sunday School on Covenant Day. It's a special day for us, and I'll get to why it's special for us in Sunday School in a minute, but worship is going to be very sweet, and we have a guest preacher this morning. It's going to be super good. Tiffany Harris, bringing the word this morning, and then this afternoon at 4, everyone is invited to the World Hunger Relief Farm for a delightful afternoon and for a terrific meal. I already got a text this morning from Jonathan Grant, who said he'd been up all night, preparing our meal, and I think he thinks it looks pretty good. And he's really good at this. So you're in for a treat tonight. We are, I need to filibuster because our speaker apparently has disappeared. So one of the really smart things I did a long time ago was happen to line up Jeremy to teach this morning. And then for Tiffany to preach. I have no voice this morning.
Why?
Yeah, having been in College Station last night until very late, in fact early this morning, I have no voice. So
Too
bad. Yeah.
Suck it up.
Yeah.
I did.
I'll preach to you from the smile on my face. Waste, compost, back to soil. So this is the cycle of life. And many of you have been part of Dayspring's, the initiation of our community composting site. Tonight at the Hunger Farm, we're going to announce the winner of the guessing game of how many pounds we collected. And we actually have a prize. So you're going to enjoy that. And good luck to you in that competition. I think you can still participate if you want to before you leave here this morning. So this is the cycle that we've been looking at. And we've been looking at the rifts of that cycle and its healing. And we've been particularly looking on a practical level at 2 different parts on that circle. So we've been looking at soil. And Butch Tyndale came and talked to us about good soil and caring for the soil and what kind of farming practices regenerate the soil and which kind damage it. Now, most of us aren't going to be farmers, but all of us eat, and all of your food somehow comes from soil. So that was interesting. So we were looking at the life of soil, and we've been looking at the other circle, which is what to do with our waste, and of course that's the compost project that we've been talking about. So sort of practically and theologically, these 2, 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock on the cycle of life, between how we grow things and treat the land, and what our relationship is with the land and the critters and the food that grows from it, and what we do with our waste, because the broken metabolic cycle sends all that waste to landfills or pollution or something. And then the soil has to be augmented in some way, and that's done by industrial chemical fertilizer processes that have lots of problems associated. Immediate payoff for sure, but problems associated with it. And we've been, theologically speaking, we've been looking at how God intends this cycle to be complete, and so our participation in it, even in small ways, is done by caring for each of these places along the way. Well, the one place we really haven't looked at is the place where it all comes together for most of us most of the time, which is what? The food. The feasting. The eating. We all eat, and we all eat somehow. And so theologically, food is at the heart of the practice and expression of Christian community and worship through the Eucharist. And we could go on talking about the symbolic importance of food. But there's also, obviously, practical dimensions to food. on an individual level from where I buy it and how I prepare it and eat it and so forth. And people have all kinds of relationships with food, some very healthy and in many cases broken. But the broken relationship with food, while it can be individual, and that can be very painful, disabilitating relationships with food, it's also the broken systems of food. Who has access to food? What does that say about us theologically? How does it connect to these other circles theologically and practically? Now that's Jeremy's world. And so the invitation here to him is to help us explore the rift in local, national, and global food production and consumption, distribution and consumption. And then, as we've been doing all along, not just the rift, but where's the healing? So Jeremy what a gift we have to have in our own community someone who's working diligently and daily on this, and who can help us look closely at that part of the whole cycle. So I'm going to say a prayer and then invite him forward. And so looking forward to a great day today as we begin talking about food, and then this evening as we feast as a community and as we take communion as part of this. So what a great day. Let's pray. Thank you for today, O Lord, our God. Even as we come into this moment, we remember our Lord who broke the meager provisions that paled in comparison to the great need in front of him on that hillside. He broke it, he gave thanks, he blessed it, and there was enough for all, even overflowing. May our hearts overflow this morning, and our minds overflow this morning as we learn and as we recommit ourselves to the ministry of breaking bread, receiving and sharing your good provision with all. Thank you for Jeremy. Bless him as he comes this morning. We lift this day to your high and holy name. Amen. Jeremy, it's all yours.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Everybody hear me all right? All right. Glad Eric didn't just spend the entire time talking about last night's game.
Well, we could. So here's the thing.
Oh, that's right.
We're not doing that?
I think it shows that both God and Satan are working in this world right now. Of all teams to finally beat Alabama, did it have to be A&M? So at least UT lost yesterday, so we can all celebrate that. We can especially celebrate that. Is that what you said, Tom? I couldn't hear you with your mask on.
You're already losing.
That's right.
Big portions of your audience.
But I'm winning with myself. That's the beauty of being a narcissist. You're your own number one audience. Well, glad to be a part of this season of creation. This is the end of the season of creation. We're going to be pivoting next week. Brett's going to talk a little bit about it, to talk about the issue of immigration. We're going to kind of connect some of those threads today, and because these threads are all interconnected, whether we wish they were or not. So we'll do that. Let me tell you a little bit about what we do at the Collaborative, and here's how I want to frame today's conversation. First of all, I need 2 volunteers that will read a passage of Scripture. I see Josh has a Bible, so Josh is one volunteer. Where's Randy? But you got a phone. And so I told Randy, since he brought in Starbucks and didn't bring me any, I was going to pick on him for every question I have. So Matthew 25. I want you to read the I was hungry text. We're going to do some Lectio this morning. So Matthew 25, 31 through 46 is what you'll be reading. So what we'll do this morning is I want to tell you a little bit about what we do. I want to connect a few dots for you. And then we're going to do Lectio and have some time to just sit with that particular passage. And then we're going to unpack it together as a group. After we do that, then we'll shift into trying to have gain a better understanding of why we have this rift between production of food. We actually produce enough food in our world right now to ensure that everybody would have access to adequate food. But here we have right now 270 million people on the brink of starvation worldwide, and over 40 million people that are considered food insecure in the U.S. So we're going to break that down. Why do we have food insecurity in the U.S.? And who is food insecure? And then why do we have 270 million people that are on the brink of starvation globally? So we'll break some of that down, and then we'll get into the role of the church and what we, as a Dayspring community, how we might be able to engage these particular issues, not just this morning, but in perpetuity. And then we'll wrap up. Does that work? All right, great. So at the Collaborative, we started in 2009 as the Texas Hunger Initiative. That was our first project. Now we have, we have a number, maybe half a dozen different projects. The Texas Hunger Initiative is one, though it will be that, and the work will continue, but the name will not continue. We're shifting to just one name as a collaborative, but essentially what we do, we are a research and innovation project at Baylor. So we have about 50 or 60 research fellows that work with us from all different academic disciplines, many of whom are Baylor faculty, and some are faculty at other universities around the U.S. And then they work in real time with our practitioner team. And so we work in research, practice, and policy. So our practitioner team are based around the state of Texas. You probably heard and know about former Congressman John Lewis when he was running Students for Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. He talked about the idea of doing incarnational organizing. They lived and dwelled among the people that they were organizing during the civil rights movement. So we've taken that idea and we've applied it to the food and hunger and poverty space. And so we have field offices around the state of Texas so that people can be immersed in the everyday realities of what's happening in community. You may have heard the quote, the Stephen Covey quote, that leadership moves at the speed of trust. And so we know that getting and reorganizing, and that's really what it is, reorganizing our local communities to address issues of hunger requires trust. And so our regional teams all work to cultivate trust and build trust in the community so that they can get the community to work together for a common purpose. And then that's all translated into policy, because ultimately our job is to create or cultivate scalable solutions to end hunger. And so we translate that to policy because that's typically where scale happens. So many of you have probably volunteered at a Meals on Wheels program at some point in your life, or at Caritas. Well, Meals on Wheels is predominantly funded through the Elderly Food Service Program, which is a federal program. And so most of the food that is paid for in your Meals on Wheels programs around the country, where we volunteer and pick up the food, most of that is paid for through our taxes. It's paid through that Elderly Food Service Program. Our philanthropic dollars are really gravy, right? It's what allows a local organization to add more families, or maybe to help fill some gaps that the Elderly Food Service Program won't pay for. The same is true with Caritas. So Caritas, typically 80 to 90% of the food in a food bank, or in a case like Caritas, it would be called a food pantry, is funded through the TFAP program. TFAP is an acronym that essentially is for food that is provided through USDA to our food banks around the country. So the rest, that other 10 to 20% is funded typically through tax write-offs. Companies like Walmart or HEB are able to take food and give it to these food banks so that they can repurpose it for local food pantries. And then a very small percentage is through philanthropic gifts and giving. So our job is to take to take scalable solutions or to create scalable solutions and then turn them into public policy so that we can actually scale them nationwide or even in a global context. I'll give you 2 examples and then we'll jump into it. The first would be Meals to You. So some of you may have seen a project that we did this past year. Meals to You was a program. So I served on a congressional commission for a few years and called the National Commission on Hunger. And so we traveled around the country, sat down with individuals who were food insecure, met with organizations that were addressing the issue, and then created a plan for USDA and then President Obama and Congress to end hunger in America. It was a bipartisan commission, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and a great experience. But one of the things that we identified is that what was working to address hunger in urban America wasn't translating to rural America. And because in rural America, you don't have grocery stores, you don't have nonprofit organizations that can set up summer meal programs for kids or anything like that. So ironically, rural America, you're surrounded by food, but you don't have access to that food anymore because we don't have small farms. You don't own and operate a small family farm, like we used to. And so now that farmland is typically farmed by what we would call big ag, but it's typically a farmer who is leasing land and has to lease tens of thousands of acres just to be able to pay for that tractor, because that tractor is worth more than their house. Mm-hmm. And so their margins, they're typically upside down. So the American farmer is not making a lot of money, even though they're having to farm tens of thousands of acres to be able to try to make a living. So you've got these rural communities that are surrounded by food, but don't have access to it. And so that was an observation that we made as a commission. I came back to Texas and I talked to our field offices to see if they were observing the same thing. And then I went to our researchers, they were. Then I went to our researchers, they were also observing the same thing. And so we realized we've got to come up with a pathway forward to addressing hunger in rural America, just like we're doing every day in urban America. What we identified in partnership with USDA was one particular strand that we wanted to start with, which was addressing summer hunger for kids. So they get out of school, you got high poverty areas, they get out of school, and they don't have access to a USDA summer meal program. So you see Waco ISD and Midway ISD and some of the nonprofits in the community every summer set up summer meal programs around our community. Again, that's a program that's funded through USDA, but administered by the local community. Well, you can't do that if you've got sets of kids who live 45 minutes in one direction from a school. It's not financially feasible for a school to go pick them up in the summer and bring them back to a school cafeteria for a summer meal program, nor is it feasible for that family to drive that child into the campus. So what we did is we decided, well, if we can't get kids to the food, we'll trust that's the spirit, and or one of my teenage boys messing around. Both are very likely. So probably the teenage boys may even be more likely. So so since we couldn't get the meals to we couldn't get kids to the meals, we had to figure out how we could get meals to kids. So we developed this Meals to You program in partnership with McLean Global, a food distribution company, and we mailed a box of food, a week's worth of food, to a child's front doorstep. So we had 4,000 children on a demonstration project, a 10-week demonstration project in the summer of 2019 with 20 school districts in East and West Texas. And we mailed them a box of food every week that would have breakfast, a lunch, and a snack for each of the days that they would typically be in school. So it worked great. We used USPS and UPS so that we could have as light of an environmental footprint as possible. Because those trucks are already going to these communities, so it's like, hey, let's just build upon that. But because we used the traditional shipping sources, it also meant we had to use shelf-stable food. But many of you know a lot of people that work with our organization, and so they were quick to make sure that it was, that the beef sticks were from free-range cattle, and it was Horizon organic milk, and a lot of that in those early boxes in 2019, which was great. So the program worked, and so USDA came back to us at the behest of Congress and asked us to expand the program to Alaska and New Mexico. That was our plan. So remember, our job is to cultivate scalable solutions in hunger. So if it can work with 4,000 kids in Texas, can it work with 10,000 kids in some other states? So that's what we do on a daily basis. That was the plan before the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic hit, I was in D.C. I was actually in a bunch of different cities during this time, but in D.C. right before, that was spring break week, and we were beginning to hear that at that point that schools were thinking about extending spring break for a week or two, and so USDA brought me over to their offices and said, can you scale this program nationwide if schools shut down? And but none of us really believed it was going to happen. I certainly didn't. But we're like, sure, we'll make preparations as if we're going to do that. And then by that weekend, schools were closing. We were in dire straits. And so they asked us to take on 25,000 kids. Well, when we opened up the program nationwide, we had 150,000 children sign up for the program in the first week. And so we're like, this is going to be much bigger than we thought. We ended up having about 300,000 children that enrolled in the program, where we served them 2 meals a day in 43 states plus Puerto Rico. And we had to work with Guam to completely rebuild their food system. But they were too far, they're closer to Japan than they are the U.S. And so we had to work through different international shipping sources because of supply chain disruption and so forth. So that's the kind of stuff that we do. We end up serving about 40 million meals to those kids while they were out of school time. And these are children in America's most remote locations. So children in Alaska receive boxes of food either by seaplane or helicopter or by dog sled teams. We had some communities that were so remote. We had one superintendent called me and said, I don't think you understand how remote we are. And I was like, of course I don't. And he said, we're 300 miles from the nearest road system. Some of the children receive boxes of food in communities that could see Russia from their front porches. The children in the Havasu tribal community that live at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and just one of the most beautiful spots on the planet, but also a literal desert, received boxes of food on the backs of mule teams that took boxes of food. But then everybody else, typically a UPS truck or a USPS truck delivered the food. That's the kind of stuff that we do. We also organize communities because we don't believe any one sector can end hunger by themselves. So it inherently requires churches working with government agencies and school districts and industry and the nonprofit sector. And when we build a collaborative intervention like that, then we believe we can do more together than we can if we work individually within our own space. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's who we are at the collaborative. We've got partners all over the country, and now some global partners that we're working with. And it's a really fun place to work. Nancy works with us, and we've got a lot of day springers that work at the collaborative, doing the heavy lifting on a daily basis. So I want to connect the dots. So last week we celebrated the Feast of St. Francis, kind of a day early, and you referenced Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, and that movie made a major impact in my personal life. So I was a junior after my junior year of college. I was a youth minister in Birmingham, really struggling with issues of inequity. When I was sitting down in my fraternity house, an old house that was barely put together with duct tape, and I flipped on the TV, and this story, Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, was on. And I was a little hippie-ish, and so it worked for me. And but I didn't know who it was. It was Francesco is how Francis is referred to, that whole movie. And being a Baptist kid, I didn't know a whole lot about St. Francis. Didn't know anything about this Francesco guy. But all I saw was this guy who encountered the gospel in a powerful way, and he realized that it was his possessions at that time in his life that were prohibiting him from loving his neighbor as himself. And so he radically gives away his possessions, moves outside the safety of the city gates with the poor and the lepers, and ends up rebuilding San Diamano Church, and we know the story from there. Well, when I saw that movie, it was an answer I had been searching for really for 3 years at that point. And so I knew exactly what I needed to do. I needed to gather up all my stuff, so I got all my stuff down off the walls and off the shelves in my little my little apartment and loaded it up in my car, drove over the mountain. I went to Sanford and Birmingham, drove over the mountain into downtown Birmingham, where Kelly Ingram Park is, which is where a lot of the civil rights activity happened, like the children who were protesting that they got hosed down by the Birmingham police officers and fire department. That's where the homeless would hang out, because there's a Mission Firehouse homeless shelter a few blocks away. I went down there and I gave away all my stuff, and I knew at that point that I was called to the issue of hunger and poverty. I just didn't know what that meant. I'd never heard of nonprofit work, but when you brought that up last week, that story changed the direction of my life. And so the reason I'm doing the work that I'm doing now and working with great people like I get to work with on a daily basis is because God moved very powerfully for me through that particular random, hippie film from the late, what was it, 60s or 70s?
72.
Yeah. And but spoke to me in a very powerful way. So it was neat. On the actual Feast of St. Francis Day, I was with your wife and the Truett team, or the Truett class out at the farm. And so we were talking a little bit about how to address hunger, and we had chickens literally crawling over our feet. And I was like, this is how you should celebrate the Feast of St. Francis. It was a very special moment, so very grateful for that. Well, let's encounter the text for a few minutes. Josh, I want you to start, and here's what I want us to do. So most of you are probably familiar with like the O Divina. Just a quick run through. We're going to read it 3 times, and so it's a little bit of a long passage. But the first time, I just want you to sit and hear it, and we're going to have a moment of silence to let you absorb it. The second time, which is when Randy's going to read, I want you to be listening to a particular word or phrase that jumps out at you. And then after he finishes reading, then I want you to take some silent time to reflect on that word or phrase. And then the third time, I'll read it the last time. I want you to ask the Spirit to speak to you specifically about this passage. And then we're going to unpack it together. Does that work? All right, go ahead, John.
Okay.
Why don't you stand up, and if you don't mind, take your mask off when you read so everybody can hear you.
Where we starting?
Matthew 25, verse 31
and through 46.
through 46.
When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer him, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they also will answer, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister to you?" Then he will answer them, saying, Truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life.
When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right, and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom, prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me." They will all also answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or needing clothes, or sick in prison, and did not help you?" He will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life.
When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels are with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory, and all nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father in heaven, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of this world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" The king will answer them, truly as you did it for one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. Then he will say to those on his left hand, you that are accursed, depart from me into eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you didn't give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you didn't visit me. Then they will also answer, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and didn't take care of you? Then he will answer them, truly I tell you, just as you didn't do it for the least of these, you didn't do it for me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. The word of the Lord for God's people. All right. What stuck out to you in that particular passage? What's that? Contrast. All right, unpack that for me.
Sheep, goats, separation, clothing, not clothing.
Excellent. Yep. Other thoughts? What stuck out to you? Mike, you look like you're on the verge of saying something.
Well, to continue the same contrast, some people are going to inherit a lifetime of God, and others are not.
Mm-hmm.
And it's strictly based on your response to the poor, the hungry, the disenfranchised. That's where it stops. It's not a gentle story.
That's right. It's the only apocalyptic or eschatological scene in the entire Gospel of Matthew, which is interesting that when it comes down to if you're in or you're out, that's what's pointed out in that particular passage.
We oftentimes think about Jesus. Everybody's in.
Right.
So this is rather shocking. Good news.
Yep. Good news? It's like in italics. All right, that's great. Other thoughts? Yes, sir.
Yeah, the metaphor of comparing us to sheep and goats. I have a friend in Australia who runs a farm. He was a sheep farmer for a long time. Then he decided he'd get into Kashmir and he got some goats. Now, the sheep, if they got out, and he was on a country road, winding gravel road, if a car hit one of these animals, that was bad news. If sheep got out, he could send out a couple of dogs and they'd bring the sheep back in. If a goat got out, he had to go out with his rifle and fulfill the prophecy of this reading right then and there. Because the goats were so dumb, you could not get them back in easily anyway. And so you had to do something about that. So anyway, that's a longer story of, there's the sheep, there's the goats. Sheep are not all that smart, but they're smarter than the goats.
Yeah. Great, that's good. Starting to understand why my 7th grade English teacher kept calling me a goat now. Appreciate you bringing that all together for me. Feel great.
Well, and the sheep can be fed, but the goat couldn't be.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
It's interesting that both the sheep and the goats had a lack, I want to say it this way, lack of consciousness about the presence of Christ and certainly the outcome of what they might do or not do. So those who were sheep were not saying, we need to get out and feed some hungry people because our theology knows the benefit of sending in. It's just what their transformed sheep self did.
Right. Right.
There wasn't a strategy involved
Right.
here to get the right side
Yep.
and left side.
Yeah, the righteous and the accused both were shocked that was the criterion for judgment. So, yeah. Other thoughts?
At the risk of sounding like the lawyer who prompted the parable, of the Good Samaritan, I was wondering what y'all thought about who are these people that Jesus are talking about. Because it seems very specific. You know, my family or least of these and who are those people? It sounds like I'm asking who are my neighbors, but I just
Yep.
wondered what y'all thought.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
There is in Matthew a strong theme of fulfilling Israel's call. Matthew 1 starts with, it all starts with Abraham.
Right.
And if you look back at Genesis 12, there's this statement, those who bless you I will bless, and those who curse you I will curse. And so it probably has some connection to the true Israel in the Gospel of Matthew. And assuming that they would probably be among the poor. So these nations are the ones who tend to justice, tend to the poor, among whom are the true Israel.
Yeah. I thought that was a point. One of the things that you pointed out was that members of Jesus' family. Oftentimes we get stuck on the least of these. And what hit me with this particular passage is that Jesus identifies with the people who are poor, hungry, naked, the stranger, or we might translate that now, migrant. He calls those members of his family. And the rest of us are judged based upon what we do or do not do for members of his family, which that's at least something that jumped out to me. So I think that's other thoughts. Yes, sir, Tom.
Going back to what Bert was saying about their consciousness of what they were, what they were doing, that kind of brought up the idea of election. Like some are elected and some are not.
Yeah. I can see that. Did the passage, did any particular aspect of the passage hit you or prompt you in a particular way?
Well, I've heard this story shared as kind of a picture of a party where we're invited in, and depending on how we are guests at that party, it could be kind of a attitude or perspective of abundance where we're like, wow, this is a great party, let's see how many people we can invite in and reach out and see those that aren't in the party and bring them on in, versus people that are at the party that are like, wow, this is great food, let's stick it in our pockets and duck out the back. And just that kind of scarcity mindset versus abundance mindset, and how plugged in we are to our fellow people on the planet. I mean, it's not just are you in the family or are you out? It is, what do you need and what do I have that can help fill that need? And just kind of an aperture shift from right here, right in front of my face to further out.
Yeah. That speaks to what Eric was talking about at the beginning, right? So the rift, right? The rift. Now, our Catholic brothers and sisters, and now the United Nations has adopted this idea of a right to food. And so if we think about kind of what you're talking about, And we think about this idea of a right to food. You think about a right to vote. So I mean, a lot of our arguments right now in the U.S. are all about does everybody have actual access to be able to vote? Because that's a standard measurement that we use in the U.S. because everybody has a right to vote. And so if you prevent me from being able to vote with your laws or whatever, then I can legitimately speak up and say, I have a right to vote, and you are denying me that right. Now imagine if we flip that and we think about that with food. So if we are actually producing enough food for everyone to be able to have access, for everyone to be able to have enough. And so right now, hunger worldwide is not about famine. It used to be famine. Remember in the 80s, for those of you who can remember, I think most of us can remember the 80s. Normally, most of the audiences that we're talking to can't, so it's nice. Y'all can remember the 80s. You're not judging me for remembering the 80s right now. But remember the 80s, you remember the famine in Ethiopia. And famine in Ethiopia hits almost once a decade and has for about 500 years. Isn't that crazy? But you remember famine in the 80s, and so we would see those images of the children with distilled bellies. And it was because you had famine, they didn't have access to it. Now, that's not necessarily the case. We produce enough food for everybody to have enough. But our issue is in access, in part, I think, because we don't have that framework of a right to food. Because if everybody has a right to food, bridges and where we build roads and bridges, it fundamentally changes everything. And so I think that's kind of part of where you're going. It's kind of beginning to say, okay, how do we have this abundant mindset? Jesus operates from this place of abundance, and those of us, particularly in these difficult times, easily go to a place of scarcity, right? Hoard my own, protect it. I was with a student this week, and he said, when all that, when you went to the grocery store at the beginning of the pandemic and there was no food there, he said he was tempted to I need bullets for my guns so I can protect my food. And this is a very generous kind of spirited student, but that was where his mind immediately went. Well, anything else? Yes, sir.
I just want to say that the thing that jumped out to me was being thirsty and drink, and the absence of clean water in a good part of the world, and how if you live in the tropics, and so you get thirsty very quickly.
Yep.
And how if you give someone a drink in that situation, it's a real thankfulness comes to them. We had a little house at a center where we used to go to, and nearby was a national high school of 400 or 500 kids, and they got to know that if they stopped by our house, they'd get a drink.
Yeah.
So and it's an expression of love, I think, to give someone a drink.
Yeah.
But in so many places, there's just not good water.
That's right. That's made me thirsty when you said that. But I was on a phone call or a Zoom call with some people from the UN and working on Middle East peace processes. And so we hear a lot about Jerusalem resettlement issues, and there's a lot of this rocket goes over here, and these people are hurting. And but when you distill it down to what can bring some peaceful solutions in the Middle East, it's water. And so the whole 2-hour meeting was about how can we take the desalinization plants that are on the Mediterranean coastline, largely in Israel, add a few more, put 2 in Gaza so that they can have access to clean water. And it's all about pipelines, getting the water from those plants to the Jordan River Valley, because that's what provides food for almost everybody in that region and in the Jordan, which is, Jordan right now is a humanitarian disaster. So it's interesting, when you begin to pull apart at this particular passage, and you get to that question of who are we talking about, I think that's when you begin to kind of realize the interconnectedness of these issues. Well, very briefly, we're already out of time, and I'm like a third into our lesson, which is pretty typical. But hunger in the U.S., here's what it looks like. You've heard the term intersectionality, and for whatever reason, we get all worked up about that term. All it means is that there's an interconnectedness of issues. So the primary cause of hunger in the U.S. right now is underemployment, meaning that people are employed, but they don't make enough money to be able to make ends meet. If you're in a $7.25 an hour job, and you're able to get 40 hours a week worth of work, 52 weeks out of the year, you still bring home less than $15,000 a year. So that means that you're forced to decide, am I going to pay for food? Am I going to pay for rent? Am I going to pay for childcare? Am I going to pay for medical costs? You don't make enough money to be able to pay for everything, so at the end of the month, you're forced to make trade-offs. You have to decide which bills am I going to pay. If you don't pay rent, you're kicked out of your home. We don't have very good public transit in places like Waco, right? So if you live outside of just kind of the narrow corridor, you've got to have transportation. If you don't pay your car payment, your car gets repossessed. But if you don't pay for food, well, sure, that leads to a whole myriad of health problems, and your kids aren't going to be able to pay attention in school. You've got all kinds of ramifications, but people typically make food their trade-off in the U.S. And it typically happens at the end of a pay period. So hunger in the U.S. or food insecurity is episodic. So it's typically not a permanent state, but it's episodic at the end of a pay period. And so you stretch your food budget. You do that by either purchasing unhealthy food, highly processed foods, like Eric and Josh were kind of referring to in the last few weeks. You go to the dollar menu, right? Whatever you can to put food in your belly or food on your family's table. Many parents choose not to eat for periods of time, or they reduce consumption. But oftentimes when you see diet-related disease, like early onset diabetes and heart failure and whatnot, that's the flip side of the coin of food insecurity, because people oftentimes live in these areas that are food deserts where they don't have access to healthy food, or they're trying to buy the cheapest food possible to get to the end of the month. And so they're both experiencing diet-related disease, and they're food insecure in the U.S. So you have these intersectionality of issues. USDA just came out with their food insecurity numbers a few weeks ago, and the rates of food insecurity between households of people of color and white households continued to widen. Here we are in 2021, and we're still seeing ramifications of structural racism. And so kind of thinking about what Jenny talked about in the very first session. Let's shift very quickly to global hunger, and then Brett is going to talk to us a little bit about what's going to be happening. Global hunger, different subset of issues. When we think about what's happening in the Northern Triangle, so that's Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and all those migrant families ending up in South Texas. Why is that happening? Well, it's happening for a myriad of reasons. The primary driver of global hunger is man-made conflict. So the war in Afghanistan, what's been happening in Iraq, the civil war in Yemen, the civil war in Ethiopia, if you want to call it a civil war, drug violence and cartel violence in Mexico and in Central America. The primary cause to global hunger is man-made violence. Second cause is going to be climate change. So I have visited some Mayan farms in Guatemala where Mayan farm workers have been growing food for thousands of years, like not 100 years. These aren't 200-year-old farms. These are farms that have been around for a long time. But what used to be the rainy season and what used to be the dry season is all messed up now, and those farms have literally eroded into the ocean. So they're gone. And so families are forced, what do you do when your livelihood is gone? So right now, hunger is the primary driver for migration. That's the primary reason that people are coming to the U.S. right now from Central America and now Haiti. And we're about to see a huge, probably hundreds of thousands of Haitians, starting to arrive on our doorstep. What we saw a few weeks ago, those images that we saw in Del Rio, that's just the beginning of what's going to be happening for a while. So, quick story. A friend of mine was talking about some work that they're doing in Honduras, and he said that if you're running a successful business in Honduras, oftentimes what happens is the gang will put a cell phone on the front stoop of your business, and as soon as you see that cell phone, you know that you're either going to have to start paying. They're going to start extorting you, trying to steal your money. And if you're not unwilling to pay, they'll kill you. And so as soon as you see that cell phone, you typically have to take off. That's when families immediately go home, they pack up, and they head to the U.S.